Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we dive into the battle over TikTok and talk to Gabriel Scheinman of the Alexander Hamilton Society about how America's college students see the debate. And then we've got an in-depth discussion with Michael O'Hanlon of the Brookings Institution about the future of warfare, great power competition, and the intersection of politics and the military. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security reporter here at the Washington Times, and I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, national security editor here at the Times. We've got a lot to get to this week, Guy, from the war over TikTok to whether the Pentagon's inadvertently helping Hamas with its casualty numbers from the Gaza Strip. But first things first, it's good to see you. How are you and what's on your radar right now?
Hey, Ben, thank you. It is great to be here. As always, I want to highlight a couple of things churning around the U.S. NatSec water cooler at the moment. One is Haiti, where widespread gang violence continues to create chaos. This has been building since the assassination of Haiti's president back in 2021. The situation is on my radar because it's a foreign policy failure of the Biden administration, but also, the situation really shows the limits of U.S. influence in Latin America. The U.S. is the largest donor to Haiti's national police force and a key humanitarian donor. I'm tracking this because while the Biden administration has said it won't deploy U.S. troops to support the national police, the administration has already sent a small contingent of U.S. Marines to evacuate Americans, and there are signs now that the White House wants to use the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay to help house and process migrants fleeing from Haiti.
Look, how this situation plays out in Haiti could potentially be a major campaign issue, especially if there are a lot of migrants coming from there. And look, we talked last week about how the Biden-Trump rematch is now set. And it's going to be fascinating to see, to me, how both of these men sort of handle the, small scale rebellions, I guess you could say, within their own parties on some key national security and foreign policy issues. We'll get into more depth about TikTok later, Guy, but Donald Trump urged Republicans to oppose the bill that passed the House that essentially forced ByteDance, the Chinese internet company, to sell the very popular app or see it banned in the U.S. And not all House Republicans listened. The bill passed. There's also a fair number of Republicans who aren't listening to Trump on Ukraine aid. Biden's got his own problems here. Last week, 14 Democrats voted in favor of a resolution condemning the administration's handling of the southern border. The measure accused Biden and the Homeland Security Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas, of creating, quote, the worst border security crisis in the nation's history, and claimed the president, quote, systematically dismantled effective border security measures and interior immigration enforcement. I don't know if this is a Trump campaign ad. It probably will be, I would imagine, here in a few months. And Biden, of course, has other problems on his liberal flank from those who want to see the U.S. more forcefully break with Israel because of the humanitarian conditions in Gaza. Why does this matter? Well, Guy, as you well know, politics informs policy. The platforms of Donald Trump, to one degree or another, will be influenced by politics and where public sentiment is. And Biden's policies will be too. We've already seen that with his trip to the border a few weeks ago after 3 years of all but ignoring the problem. His issues might not be as important to voters as the economy, but these are two men who are going to try to create a sense of command within their own parties. It's harder to sell a unifying vision for the country if your own party is in disarray and having very public disagreements on major national security and foreign policy issues. So, Guy, do you think either of them, Trump or Biden, can they corral their parties, the elements within their parties, and present a coherent foreign policy and national security platform ahead of the 2024 election?
Ben, I think you're right to highlight this. I am not sure yet. I do agree that every foreign policy development from here on out until November is going to be tinged by the question of whether Biden is doing what he's doing because of election politics or for real policy goals. And the same can be said for Trump. The one thing I'll say is that the national security and foreign policy issues in general are going to be in the spotlight in unprecedented ways between now and November because Biden and Trump both have actual track records as commanders in chief managing or mismanaging America's position in the world. I actually got into this in the latest Threat Status Influencers video series. I sat down with South Carolina Republican Congressman Joe Wilson. He's got an amazing office on Capitol Hill, Ben. It is full of historic knickknackery photos, all kinds of cool things. But we got deep into this discussion about foreign policy heading into the election. He's got interesting opinions about Trump and Biden. You can watch that exclusive interview on the Washington Times website. On another front, I actually want to dig into this increasingly heated TikTok debate, the passage by the U.S. House of a bipartisan bill that intends to leave TikTok's China-based owner ByteDance with two choices: either cut its own ties to the company or face a ban in the United States. This is a big deal. TikTok has a lot of users, especially among young people in the United States, and the battle lines are now drawn ahead of a potential Senate vote on the bill. As we try to grapple with why there's so much unease about TikTok, I want to go to a couple of audio clips from another threat status video interview that I did recently with Craig Singleton, who heads the China program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Craig talks about the alleged involvement of the Chinese government intelligence apparatus in ByteDance's operations, and by virtue of that, TikTok's operations. He also talks about the lobbying that ByteDance is doing in the United States to try and shape the debate on TikTok among young people and on Capitol Hill. Let's play those clips.
The Chinese are not simply trying to impact what our kids are seeing. They're trying to impact how they think, how they see the world. Throughout TikTok and its parent company ByteDance, the Chinese Communist Party has ideological cells installed at every single level of the company, from the C-suite on down to the basic engineer. And the reason is that they can control the algorithm and the platform itself. So they can choose to amplify certain content and suppress other content. So they can amplify, for example, content that portrays the United States as chaotic and dysfunctional, that makes Chinese governance and Chinese autocracy appear like a more sensible form of governance. ByteDance has the best lobbying sort of structure that money can buy here in the United States. Today, they employ some of the most powerful K Street firms to advance their interests, whether it's Crossroads Strategies and Melman and Denton's. They are putting their money where their mouth is. And their goal is to influence and gum up the process. The best way to think about it is, in today's modern age, information is a currency, and autocrats are keen to use it to buy leverage.
That's a fascinating discussion, Guy. Very timely.
Yeah, it's kind of sobering. I was trying to figure out, meanwhile, whether this narrative that Generation Z or young people on TikTok are against U.S. government intervention. I got into a discussion about that this week with Gabe Scheinman, the executive director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. That's a nonprofit group that's at the center of educating, engaging, and inspiring young Americans on college campuses around the country towards service as future national security and foreign relations leaders. Gabe had some interesting things to say about what the students he interacts with think about the TikTok situation. Gabe, thank you for joining me. Before we get into the ins and outs of TikTok, tell me a little bit about what the Alexander Hamilton Society does on U.S. college campuses and how this debate is really intersecting with your work.
I appreciate that. Well, we exist at the intersection of college campuses and foreign policy. And these days, between TikTok or some of the craziness that you see post October 7th, on college campuses, we're really in the thick of things. So what do we do? So we have chapters, student-led chapters on college campuses across the country, over 60. We do 250 events a year. And those college campuses invite speakers that share our worldview that thinks that America is an exceptional country by dint of its birth, that it has an exceptional role to play in the world. And we bring those people to campus to actually debate local professors who tend to not share those views. And try and win some of the hearts and minds that you see on campus, and then use that as a launching pad for a much greater network into Washington, D.C. Our point of view is that the U.S. really needs to be a strong and principled leader in the world, and understands that the virtue of our own success in the world, and a lot of it, what we brought to others, is the values that help found our own country.
Do you find that students that are involved in chapters for Alexander Hamilton Society are really tracking this TikTok debate? Are they even aware of what's going on with this legislation in Washington?
TikTok is absolutely at the front of a lot of the minds of Gen Z or today's college students. There's no question about it, only because, if a third or half of Americans are on TikTok, it's something like 2/3 of people under the age of 25. The question is whether they track the ins and outs of the bill that passed the House earlier. That's a different question. And there's a lot of misinformation out there, even put out, like people like TikTok saying this is a ban on TikTok, which is not actually true. That's in the bill. And the reason I think they track, or at least the students involved who care about national security traffic, is twofold. One is the question about, how much control does the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, surely have over the app, and how do they use it to both acquire and then manipulate data in that ways? And the second, I think, is a question of privacy. We sort of live in a moment where privacy is not the word we think about a lot when it comes to national security issues. But for the younger generation, they really do care about these things. And so when I talk to our students all the time, they're very up to date on this debate, and our students maybe sit apart from where the general Gen Z population actually is.
There is this narrative, though, that young people are the ones who use TikTok, and that they're somehow being lobbied, or they're against the idea of government intervention. Are you finding that folks involved with the work that Alexander Hamilton Society is doing, are they against it? Or are they sort of like, actually, it might be good for there to be some kind of a sale of ByteDance to an American company? Where do they stand on the legislation?
So we have a large network. I mean, we
Yeah.
have 10,000 students that come through our events. We have 600 leaders. So, I'm sure there's a lot of different opinions, but some of the leaders of our chapters that I do talk to, they understand the fundamental difference between the nature of the U.S. government versus the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and the nature of the People's Republic of China. And the issue is not a question of, is TikTok good for you like other social media? Are they good for you or bad for you? The issue is that, is this a tool and can even be fashioned into a weapon, frankly, by a foreign adversary? And they understand that part, I think, very, very clearly.
Interesting. What else can you tell me about the awareness of a kind of U.S.-China Cold War type dynamic?
I think we shouldn't discount how young people are actually viewing this and thinking about things. They know that this is the fight of their generation in a lot of different ways, right? When we talk about new Cold War with China, or however you want to phrase it, we are talking about a multi-decade competition. Hopefully not a conflict, but a competition in a lot of different ways. And they're very aware of this, and they're very aware it's a clash of two different systems. And they're very aware of what it will mean, not only for American leadership, American allies, American forward projection, all those things. But they're very aware that if these things don't get stopped in their tracks, that it's coming to a theater near you. And that's where the TikTok thing, I think, plays in.
Gabe Scheinman, thanks so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
And we're joined now by Michael O'Hanlon. He is a senior fellow and the director of research in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. And Michael also holds the Phil Knight Chair in Defense and Strategy. Michael, thank you so much for joining the Threat Status Podcast. We really appreciate it. With the Pentagon budget having just come out recently, I wanted to get your take on what jumped out in that document, and sort of your broad assessment of U.S. military readiness today, and if there are any specific areas, hypersonics, for instance, has come up recently, where you think there's a reason for Americans to be concerned about where the U.S. is today versus China and Russia, for example.
Great. Thank you. And thanks for having me on, and congratulations on your new podcast. It's a privilege to be part of it. I think that at one level, there are not many big surprises. This is about an $850 billion budget request for the Department of Defense, almost $900 billion when you add in nuclear weapons activities at the Department of Energy, which are considered to be also part of the broader national defense budget. So before long, we'll be pushing $1 trillion a year on overall national defense. And that does not count, by the way, Veterans Affairs or Homeland Security. I think overall, it's a pretty good budget. It's a little smaller than I would prefer, despite my having just said it's huge, because it does not really provide any real growth. People who say that's a huge amount of money are correct, but relative to the size of our economy, it's only 3.1% of GDP.
It's also going down, right? I mean, projected going forward with inflation. I heard Lindsey Graham talking about this, I think, on the floor the other day, that it's like we'll be well under 3% on this trajectory.
Yeah, I think Senator Graham's correct that as long as we hold flat in nominal terms, that means we're going down relative to inflation. Meanwhile, the economy is still growing, so we're going down even faster relative to the size of GDP. Now, there is no right answer as to what percent of GDP the defense budget should be, but in the Cold War, it was typically between 5% and 10%. In the peak years of George W. Bush and Barack Obama with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, it was 4.5%. So this is a manageable burden compared to history, compared to the rest of the federal budget. So what jumps out at me is that it's flat. Even in this dangerous world, it's big, but it's flat. And compared to inflation and compared even more to GDP, it's actually going slightly down, as you say. You mentioned hypersonics. Yes, I certainly want to keep pushing hypersonics, but I'll tell you the overall category of effort that concerns me the most, it's improving our resilience, our hardening, whether it's of the military bases, military logistics, national infrastructure needed to move forces around the United States to get them to ports and airfields so they can go overseas. It's that kind of resilience that we haven't had to worry about when in the last 50 years we've been fighting, the Viet Cong and the Taliban and Saddam Hussein. Nobody's had the ability to reach out and touch us from a long ways away with either direct kinetic attack or cyber attack. But now the most concerning potential adversaries do have that capability. And I want to harden our military and our national infrastructure against those threats. So that's part of where I would put any extra dollars that we could muster.
Well, in terms of U.S. military forces, Michael, I'm curious to get your take on how you think the Biden administration has handled various conflicts in the Middle East, particularly with the Houthis right now. Are you concerned, for example, that the Houthi attacks are still going on and that perhaps we found ourselves in another open-ended engagement where it's not entirely clear what the metrics for declaring quote unquote victory might actually be for the US?
Yes, that's a fair point, but I'm also sobered and haunted by the fact that a lot of times in the American psyche, when we see this kind of an open-ended problem, our temptation is to try to go solve the problem, like go in deep. And, in the 1990s, we had a problem with Saddam Hussein and we were tired of it after a while. And we've still got a problem with North Korea. We're tired of that. But we went in to invade Iraq in 2003, and that made things a whole heck of a lot more complicated. And I'm glad we have not gone in to invade North Korea. So with the Houthi, when I put the whole thing together, of course, it troubles me. But if you look at global shipping costs today, they are higher than they were a year ago, but they're much less than during COVID. So in other words, the effect of the Houthi attacks is significant, but it's modest by historical perspective and compared with other things we've had to cope with in the modern era. And you can go around the Cape of Good Hope. And there is enough global shipping that, even though some companies may not want to wait the extra 10 or 15 days for stuff, we're not going to bring the world economy to a standstill because we can't go through the Suez Canal. By the way, I think we probably can go through the Suez Canal because the mission that we are leading is mostly effective, not completely, but mostly. And so anybody who really wants to take the trip could do it. I'll put it this way, not hoping like I'm trying to sound like with false bravado, but if you offer me a ship ride through the Red Sea right now, I would take it. I mean, I think the odds of being hit are pretty low. And in any event, we can go around the Cape of Good Hope. So I don't want to solve that problem if that means putting U.S. troops ashore.
What about the wider geopolitics of the Houthi clash? The Russian propaganda this week claimed the Houthis have a hypersonic missile. There's also talk of Chinese anti-ship ballistic missile tech in the Houthi arsenal. Is there really a Russia-China role in the Houthi clash, or should the situation maybe be changing how we in Washington read what the China-Russia roles are in wider Mideast conflict at the moment?
That's a good question. First of all, I haven't seen any evidence to corroborate those allegations. Doesn't mean they're untrue. I don't know of the evidence. Second, my hypothesis would be that while Russia might do it, China would not. And I think we need to keep remembering to distinguish between Russia and China. In fact, I think we risk pushing them closer together if we paint them with the same brush, because even though China has helped Russia in this war with economic trade, it has not provided weapons. And Russia's been wanting Chinese weapons and it hasn't received them. And China, I think, has been trying to essentially walk a fine line, which is probably impossible.
You're talking about Ukraine now.
Yeah, I'm on the Ukraine thing, but I'm going to pivot back to the Middle East in a second, because the point being that China is friendlier to Russia than we would like. But let's bear in mind the oil price cap that we helped create on Russia was designed explicitly to allow Russia to keep exporting oil and gas, because we didn't want to take all that oil and gas off the market. We just wanted Russia to be paid less for it. So in that sense, a country that's trading with Russia is not necessarily working at complete counter purposes to our own foreign policy. So now I circle back and I say China is a problem, it's a challenge, and it certainly is the most resourced and capable long-term potential adversary for the United States. However, I distinguish sharply between what Russia would want to do in the Middle East and what China would want to do. Russia is a disruptive power at this point in world affairs, and it's pretty much a dictatorship. China is an autocracy with one guy at the top who's a pretty strong leader, and too strong for my taste, but he's not a dictator like Vladimir Putin, who's just waking up in the morning and doing whatever the heck he wants with nobody else having a say. And moreover, China still wants the world economy to function. And in that regard, our problems with China are specific and serious, but they are not categorical the way they are now with Russia.
On the subject of Russia, Michael, last year you and I spoke about the war in Ukraine, and you described it as World War I. It's looking a lot like World War I with smartphones, which is a phrase that I've kind of tried to keep in the back of my mind since then. Is this conflict an outlier in that way, or do you expect all wars, or at least most of them, in the 21st century to look more like the ones in the 20th century than perhaps everyone expected?
Yeah, it's a nice question. And maybe World War I with smartphones and drones, we should maybe add that in. And of course, the smartphones are able to operate because of satellites. So if you wanted to put in a triumvirate of new capability, those would be the three: satellites, smartphones, and drones. But otherwise, World War I. And I think that when you have countries with large territorial masses and the ability to fall back from an initial defeat in one sector and then prepare defensive positions, that yes, this is the kind of thing you could expect. Now, there are other kinds of wars that could happen. Korea is not nearly as big, for example. And if China and the United States fight, it'll probably be over Taiwan, also a relatively small piece of territory, and not one prone to, trench lines being dug. It's more likely, of course, that it would be the Taiwan Strait people would be trying to use to cross or to protect. And so it's more of a maritime and amphibious kind of theater. But I do think that if you had two large countries with large territories, sort of adjacent to each other fighting, yes, you could see a lot of this kind of thing in the 21st century, and it won't necessarily be radically different from warfare of the 20th, at least not for a while. But right now, I think, and for the foreseeable future, it's still striking how much wars of today look like those of yesterday.
Michael, you brought up North Korea. A lot of people in the national security community right now frame this dynamic where, if Trump wins, it could be an opening for a new round of diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. I want to frame it another way. What about if Biden wins? Are you worried that the North Korea portfolio becomes more dangerous in a second Biden term?
Well, I'm frustrated by both those presidents, if you don't mind my saying so, because I think that we've, with the exception of Trump's first 2 years, we have for 20 years framed the North Korea problem as one we prefer to ignore, as if we have that luxury. It particularly got into this pattern under President Obama. So I actually supported what President Trump was trying to do in his diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. I just think that Trump ran out of gas or ran out of ideas. And ultimately, maybe Kim Jong-un didn't really want to do a reasonable deal. I thought there was a reasonable deal to be had, which was North Korea stop making more bombs and stop testing bombs and stop testing long-range missiles, but be allowed to keep, for the moment, the weapons it already had. We could verify that it was dismantling its production capability and not testing. And we still wouldn't have to go to places where he might have squirreled away, the few dozen nuclear weapons that he's believed to possess. And then we would lift some of the sanctions, maybe the UN sanctions, and keep the American sanctions as leverage for longer term negotiation on denuclearization.
Michael, one last thing before we go. I've written a lot about this, the so-called clash between politics and the military, and has the political realm sort of infected everything that's done inside the Pentagon and within the national sort of defense sphere. Is that the right question or the right way to frame that issue today? Is it realistic to say in 2024 that politics is over here on one side and there's an impenetrable wall between that and the military?
There never is an impenetrable wall, and I commend you for your writing and for paying attention to this issue because it is a serious concern. As you well know, through much of the modern era in the United States, the military has been our most trusted institution, and rightfully so. And I think we've had a much better group of senior leaders, generals and admirals in today's military, let's say going back to my arrival in Washington in '89, roughly that time period, than we had in the Vietnam period, or, we don't have any Curtis LeMays or any Douglas MacArthur's out around anymore, raising doubts about whether they understand civilian control of the military. And so I think we've had a very, very trusted and strong and constitutionally subservient armed forces in the modern time period in the US. However, that's at risk, as you well know. People on the right say the military is too woke. People on the left worry there are too many January 6ers in the armed forces. I think both of those extreme concerns or critiques are mostly wrong. And I think we need to pay attention to this because not only is the military less trusted, still quite trusted compared to other institutions, but a lot less than before. 50%-ish of the country now has faith in the military. It's not high enough to make me happy. But on top of that, we're seeing strains in the all-volunteer force, and we're not seeing the sort of surge of patriotism that would lead people to national service of one kind or another, including military service. So we're seeing recruiting get to be a very serious problem for the Army. Most people aren't using the term crisis yet, but if we have one more bad year, I'm going to start to use the term crisis because we've been 25% short in each of the last 2 years of recruiting, as you know. And you start to break an all-volunteer force pretty fast when you're a quarter short of your, initial grade enlisted personnel and young officers. So we got some trouble on our hands, and figuring out, reestablishing the military's non-political role in our society is crucial. At the same time, men and women in uniform deserve to have political views. They deserve to have the vote. When they retire, if they're responsible, they should consider public service, running for office. Overall, we're still in pretty good shape, but we're headed in the wrong direction on this broad set of issues. And yes, I'm concerned.
Michael O'Hanlon, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great.
Gentlemen, thank you very much.
All right, and it's now time for the threat of the week. This is a segment where Guy and I each choose a threat, whether it's domestically here at home or in some corner of the world that we think is posing a threat to you, the listeners, the American public right now. Guy, what's your threat of the week?
Ben, my threat of the week is about what's becoming known as generative artificial intelligence hallucinations. Very recently, DNI Avril Haines and CIA Director Bill Burns released an unclassified open source intelligence strategy for 2024 to 2026, the OSINT, as it's known. This document actually gets into the issue of AI hallucinations. It says that generative AI is providing opportunities for American spies analyzing open source information, but also posing serious challenges, given that generative AI tools sometimes produce hallucinations, essentially inventing answers with demonstrably false information. The implications of this are eye-opening because the more the national security community relies on AI, and we're not just talking about using it to comb through the internet and come up with reports. I think we're talking about combing through massive, potentially very sensitive private data sets involving everything from photographs in cyberspace to foreign adversary disinformation sets. There are some who warn that false information generated by AI could trigger a kind of domino effect of wrong human intelligence decisions or some kind of global disaster. This brings to mind the 2023 film Leave the World Behind. If you haven't seen Leave the World Behind, it's pretty interesting. So that's my thread of the week: generative AI hallucinations.
And probably not the last time that AI or an AI-related issue might make an appearance on the Thread of the Week segment. So stay tuned. Stay tuned for that. Mine guy is unreliable data, or in a worst-case scenario, fake numbers, and what they mean for very high-stakes debates about life, war, death, morality. I had an exclusive report last week about a letter from the nonpartisan watchdog group Center to Advance Security in America to the Pentagon, demanding all the information about how exactly the Pentagon arrived at an estimated death toll in the Gaza Strip. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin on February 29th told the House Armed Services Committee that, quote, over 25,000 Palestinians have been killed so far in the Israel-Hamas war. How did he know that? Well, shortly, just hours after that testimony, the DoD admitted the estimate came directly from figures published by the health ministry in Gaza, which is run by Hamas, and which subsequently, as we know, has a vested interest in pushing a narrative that Israel is indiscriminately killing scores of civilians in Gaza with no regard for human life. Now, let's be clear, guys, you and I have talked about before. We don't know what the death toll is. Hamas says now it's over 31,000. Maybe it is. Maybe it's higher. We certainly have no idea. Israel has its own vested interest in not necessarily wanting to admit if scores and tens of thousands of civilians have been killed. But as a journalist, we often say consider the source. And in the source of these numbers in particular is Hamas. And based on everything that we see publicly, they don't seem to differentiate between Hamas militants or innocent children. If a Hamas rocket blows up before it's launched and kills 20 people who were sheltering inside of a school, they blame those deaths on Israel. You can look at graphs of the civilian deaths, the numbers that come out from the health ministry, and it's a steady upward tick on a chart with very little variation from day to day. And some scholars have said that naturally occurring numbers just wouldn't behave that way in a war zone. There's more detail about that in the story, which you can see at WashingtonTimes.com. It's a threat because it's helping to shape a public debate around the Israel-Hamas war, including here in the U.S. It's one of the reasons the Biden administration, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and others are so irate with the Netanyahu government right now, because they see these casualty figures going up, 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 up every day. More civilians being killed, more scenes of human suffering, and children with no food, no water, nowhere to sleep. There's a real argument here that Israel should do things differently. That this campaign doesn't seem to have any clear end or metrics for victory in the Gaza Strip, that we probably do need to have a serious discussion about that. But if you're one of those people who thinks it's time for Israel to change course, I won't change your mind. Just let's not use bad data, or at least highly questionable data, to arrive at those conclusions or to have that debate. Bad data leads to bad conclusions, Guy, and sometimes that means it's a threat.
Interesting, Ben. I look forward to talking with you about it more next week.
Absolutely. We're going to be back next week here on the Threat Status Podcast. A lot to cover next week as well. Looking forward to it. Guy, we'll talk soon. Thank you all for listening. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you all next week.